welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. And today from Kyiv we have a special guest, Tamila Tasheva. She's a permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Welcome to our video podcast.
Thank you.
We are going to talk today about what is happening in Russia-occupied Crimea, but my first question will be about the recent anniversary of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from Crimea in 1944. Is what happening now in Crimea similar to these events many years ago?
Yes, definitely. It is also important to talk not only about the deportation occurred in 1944, but also about those events which had begun after the colonization and the first annexation of Crimea in 1783. By purposefully worsening conditions, the Crimean Tatars were actually forced to leave the territory of the peninsula after the destruction of the Crimean Khanate. What has been actually happening since 2014 could be characterized as a hybrid deportation, as the Crimean Tatars were not put in the freight wagons. However, such conditions were created that the Crimean Tatars were forced to leave their homeland again.
This is an essential question. What are the practices, the occupation practice of the Russian administration in Crimea to force the Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, to leave their houses, to disappear? How this occupation works on the daily basis. We'll talk much about it and about the future liberation of Crimea. But before we do it, don't forget to share, to like, to comment this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our video channel and wait for the next starting interviews. But now back to Tamila Tasheva.
Tamila, we're talking today about political prisoners in Crimea, and I see portraits in your office. Tell us, who are those people?
These are all Crimean Tatars. Here in particular is a portrait of Nariman Zhelalov, the first deputy chairman of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people. He was detained immediately after the inauguration of the Crimean platform that took place on August 23, 2022. He is now facing 17 years in prison just for participating in the Crimean platform events, during which leaders of other countries stated that Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Also for staying for 8 years with his people in Crimea for helping out country people. We now have 181 political prisoners in Crimea, and 117 of them are Crimean Tatars. The largest share of political persecution in Russian-occupied Crimea is targeted against the Crimean Tatars. These are very different people. For example, Lenia Umerova. This is a girl who was detained in December last year when she was traveling to see her sick father to take care of him. First, she had an administrative case being opened against her while she was kept in a detention center. She is now facing 25 years of imprisonment. There is also Server Mustafayev, a founder of the Crimean Solidarity Group, a movement that unites relatives of political prisoners and has been engaged in human rights activities throughout this period. He was detained in 2018, and unfortunately I can name dozens of such people, all of whom are linked to each other by the fact that they do not support Russia's occupation of Crimea. They are telling that Crimea is part of Ukraine. They consider themselves to be citizens of Ukraine, and to one degree or another have opposed the criminal occupation of the Crimean Peninsula during these 9 years of the occupation.
The situation around Umerova's family was absolutely shocking to me, as she was a young woman, as you said, 25 years old, and she was just going to help her sick father. And in fact, due to her father's illness, she had to go to Crimea and was detained there. And now she's in Moscow, right?
Yes, she is currently in Lefortovo, and the occupation authorities, the authorities of the Russian Federation, actually published a fabricated video how they investigated her, how they report that they have detained a spy. They had been holding her in a prison for 6 months while looking for a way to falsify a criminal case against her. They realized that they had nothing against her, that If that was a regular criminal trial in a country with a regular authority structure and a normal judicial branch, this case would never stand. But we see the same falsification processes with other cases as well, like the case against Nariman Jalalov, who was accused of committing an act of sabotage against a gas pipeline, while in reality he was in Kyiv at the inaugural summit of the Crimean platform. And there are, unfortunately, many more such falsified cases against our citizens. All of them are getting enormous jail sentences, up to 20 years in prison. And the only way to release all of these people is to liberate the territory of Crimea. When I'm asked, why are you fighting so hard for Crimea? We are fighting for Crimea as a sovereign territory of the Ukrainian state. But we are also fighting for people who are at this moment hostages on the territory of the peninsula. This territory is a green zone, a lawless territory at the moment, where someone can come to your home at any time, can detain you, can torture you in a detention center, and subsequently can falsify a criminal case against you and people close to you.
This is a very important idea about how a situation in Crimea can be improved only through the liberation of the peninsula. We are going to come back to this idea, but now I want to understand one thing. These investigations carried out against the Crimean Tatars in the occupied territories. This is outright discrimination, outright persecution of the ethnic group.
Absolutely. This is a genocidal practice targeting the Crimean Tatars. It is clear that the deportation of the Crimean Tatars was the act of genocide. It is recognized as an act of genocide in many countries and, of course, in Ukraine. If we talk about the Crimean Tatars as part of the Ukrainian political nation, it's genocide against the Crimean Tatars as an ethnic community, including the political Ukrainian nation. So, in fact, this is the continuation of the crimes against the Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainian political nation. We consider the current events as ethnic persecutions. Russia has been persecuting several groups of people living in the peninsula, but mostly the Crimean Tatars, because they are the least loyal group of the population. They did not accept the occupation in 2014. They did not support the Russian occupation regime. They publicly expressed their opinion. Russia, in fact, is taking revenge for this political position, for this invincibility of this relatively small group of people, either by torturing these people or by investigating, incarcerating them, by abducting them, as it happened, for instance, in the case of Ervin Ibragimov, a member of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, who had been abducted in 2016. It is still unknown where he is, as well as a number of other people who were abducted during the 9 years of this occupation.
This is European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast, and we're talking to Tamila Tasheva, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. But before we move further to the question of liberation of Crimea, there are several questions we need to discuss further. First of all, what does the occupation of Crimea means for the nature of Crimea and for the cultural heritage?
Tamila, we are hearing about the cases of the destruction of cultural heritage assets and the destruction of natural landscapes that I have heard, for example, from Mr. Chabarov, the head of Tatar Mejlis. Can you say that this is a deliberate destruction of cultural objects?
Absolutely. What we are seeing now is that there are over 220 military bases, as far as I remember, on the territory of the peninsula. There were not so many of such military bases before, and it is known that Russia is militarizing the territory of the peninsula by constantly building more military facilities there. These military facilities are also being built particularly in the territory of nature reserves. Starting from 2014, Ukraine limited supplies of water to the Crimean Peninsula via the North Crimean Canal. What did Russians start doing in response? They did not build, they did not invest in desalination facilities. They started pumping water out from artesian springs in Crimea, which then led to the salinization of the soil. Now, when there is the large war going on, which involves the use of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea for military purposes, this also significantly affects the nature. Dolphins are being washed up dead on the Black Sea coast. Huge sea areas are being polluted. So, yes, it has a very strong impact on the ecology of the Crimean Peninsula. Take the construction of the Tavria Highway as another example. To build it, and remember that this is a purely military infrastructure asset. It is out of question that this is an infrastructure asset for civilian population. This is a purely military facility that is serving the needs of the Russian military machinery. So in order to build this highway, they cut down multiple hectares of trees. Crimea is actually a very green area, and Russians just destroy these greenery areas on the territory of the peninsula. The destruction of cultural heritage is another story. What are Russians trying to do to demonstrate that Crimea is the territory of the Russian military glory, the territory historically populated by the Russians, is that they're trying to destroy cultural objects, especially those related to the Crimean Tatars, naturally. Because the presence of the Crimean Tatars in this territory is not aligning with the narrative that Crimea belongs to Russia. Russians are destroying the Bakhchisarai Palace. Recently, we received all sketches and photographs from one of the Ukrainian museums that portray how the Crimean Bakhchisarai Palace looked like prior to 1944. You know, it's just such a treasure that could be shown all over the world. During the Soviet period, the Crimean Palace was being destroyed. Then Ukraine tried to recreate certain elements after the country became independent. And after 2014, this is again the facility subjected to repeated destruction attempts. They are doing everything to ensure that there is nothing left, not even the spirit of the Crimean Tatar people.
How many Russian military personnel are stationed in Crimea at this moment?
There are about 35,000 military staff present during the peacetime in Crimea. During any military activities, they are increasing this number by some 10,000 more people. We do not have an exact number since we do not purposefully examine this issue, but there are currently around 45,000 military personnel who are present on the territory of the peninsula.
But there are not only Russian military personnel who have been relocated to Crimea by Russia. If I'm not mistaken, Russia has been implementing a special relocation program for civilians to come to Crimea since 2014.
Absolutely. This is colonization of the territory, which they had already done several centuries earlier in the 18th century. They now have been implementing the same practices since 2014. There are from 500 up to 800,000 people who has been relocated to Crimea. There are definitely at least 500,000 people. We have tracked this number based on the Russian registers. Those are Russian nationals with Russian citizenship who came to Crimea via specialized relocation programs. For instance, Zemsky teacher or Zemsky doctor. Even the names of these programs that they use to incentivize Russian nationals to move to Crimea are absolutely in peril.
Before we go further to the question of the occupation and liberation of Crimea, don't forget to share, to like this video, to comment in the commentary section, and of course don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get informed about our new stunning interviews.
Ms. Tasheva, what is Crimea's future? How do you see the liberation of Crimea?
Obviously, the first step is a deoccupation of the peninsula. This is mainly the sphere of responsibility of the Ukrainian armed forces, and there are no doubts about the deoccupation of Crimea. There are, of course, certain political and diplomatic components of this process. Our office is responsible for issues related to the reintegration processes. Jointly with the Office of the President, the Reintegration Ministry, the Parliament and others, we are currently working on a roadmap of the priority steps that will be implemented after the deoccupation. It is not a security component, but a civilian component. For instance, what form of a Ukrainian government should be established in the peninsula at the very beginning? First, it clearly will be a military administration with a gradual transition to a civilian military administration, to a fully civilian format, the electoral process, and so on. Another question is the responsibility of those people who worked with the occupation administration in the peninsula. It is clear that a certain part of these people will be held accountable on criminal charges, but the majority of them will not be held criminally responsible. We are against organizing such a witch hunt. We only want to hold accountable those who have committed crimes against humanity, human rights violations, those who have made administrative decisions and betrayed their oath of office, who conducted militarization of consciousness or propaganda in Crimea. Only they should be held accountable in the territory of Crimea. We have already started working on a national vision of how Crimea should look like in terms of economic development, tourism, which sectors of economy should be prioritized in their development. For instance, the tourism sector should not only be a summer period activity, but a year-round sector that uses the specific characteristics of the region, and also the fact that there are indigenous people living there. Of course, the peninsula should be deoccupied. It should be included in all reforms in Ukraine, which had been implemented within the last 9 years since the beginning of the Russian occupation. Of course, the rule of law should be established there, freedom of speech, and in general, all political freedoms. Ukrainians, as a political nation, value their freedom a lot. It's a fundamental value. And in fact, this correlates with the values of the Crimean Tatars, because freedom is also such a basic value for them, which lays at the very beginning of everything else. Of course, Crimea should be as free as possible. Of course, this is a territory where indigenous people will have a chance to develop, in particular the Crimean Tatars. Truth being told, we can talk a lot about the future, but the key is deoccupation and how we will implement our plans in the first years of the deoccupation process.
But we're talking about the development of tourism, which looks like a long-term objective. What we should done about those 500,000, 800,000 people who came to Crimea from Russia? How could people who have been forced by Russia to leave peninsula be returned there? And how all these goals can be achieved?
It is worth underlining that those 500,000 or 800,000 people are Russian nationals with Russian citizenship who arrived from Russia to Crimea since 2014. We're not talking at all about Ukrainian nationals who were forced to take up Russian citizenship to survive in the occupied territory. We will not prosecute them for the citizenship. This is very important to underline.
And people were forced to accept Russia's citizenship, right?
Yes, people were forced to take up Russian citizenship. In line with our federal legislative piece dated 2014 in Russia, all Ukrainian nationals who were living in Crimea in 2014 automatically became Russian nationals. Even those who did not take those Russian passports, for example, we can name Sentsov or Kolchenko, well-known political prisoners who, thank God, are now alive and are at the front at this moment. They did not have Russian passports, and courts have just added those passports in their case files. So yeah, it was coerced. In fact, it was impossible to live there without Russian citizenship, to receive medical services, education, even just to remain there on the territory of Crimea. They were forced to accept Russian citizenship. When it comes to Russian nationals living in Crimea, we are going to expel them. This is a legal practice of forced expulsion from the territory people have illegally arrived to. All Russian nationals who arrived to Crimea did it illegally. They have violated Ukraine's immigration law. These type of legislation pieces exist in any European country. If someone is trying to illegally enter, for instance, Belgium or France or Germany by violating their migration laws, country entry conditions, what will happen to such a person? They will be forcefully expelled. This is not a deportation, it's forced expulsion, a casual legal practice. I have some of my acquaintances who are surprised that we are going to expel those Russian nationals. Why would you expel Russian nationals? Yeah, because these people are, in fact, accomplices to the crime of colonization. We're not going to tolerate it. They have to leave the peninsula. We will make individual decisions on each of them because, according to international law, collective expulsions are prohibited, and we will make sure to adhere to it. We will make individual decisions, and subsequently, these people have a right to submit their cases to the Ukrainian migration authorities. If we decide that such a citizen has the right to live on our sovereign Ukrainian territory in Crimea, we can provide such services.
What do you think? What consequences the liberation of Crimea will have for the ongoing war?
In fact, it has the utmost importance. I think the key to Ukraine's victory lies also in Crimea. It will be a crushing defeat for the Russian Federation, which will mean certain changes inside the Russian regime itself and in the substance of the Russian Federation in general. But the key is that Crimea should never be considered separately from any other issues. Ukraine insists on such an approach to return under its condition absolutely all territories within the internationally recognized borders without any time limits or double protectorates, as some experts are starting to propose. No, because this is a security issue, security of Ukraine to prevent such events from reoccurring, and security for our international partners. Only demilitarization, deoccupation of this territory can ensure sustainable peace in our region.
What do you think? Why there are all these proposals to postpone settling the question of Crimea and to consider it separately from the issues of Donbas, Kherson regions and other regions? Why is this proposal, let's just wait?
Well, there are several components in this question. The first component, let's call it a historical component, because such Russian narratives are very strong in the minds of particularly Europeans, but not only in Europe. These narratives are also strongly accepted in the countries of the global south, that Crimea was never a part of Ukraine and it is the territory of Russia. We answer such narratives with a proposal to look at a map of Ukraine, where people can immediately understand that Ukraine's mainland has more connections with the Crimean Peninsula, that there are indigenous people living in Crimea. Until 1783, when the Crimean Khanate was destroyed, 95% of the Crimean population was the Crimean Tatars and other indigenous peoples. The period when Crimea was part of the Soviet Russia, the Russian Empire, was shorter than any other historical period or period under the protectorate of other world powers such as the Ottoman Empire. Crimea and Ukraine's mainland were historically very connected. The Cossack period can be taken as an example. This narrative of Russia's Crimea has taken very strong roots because Russian propaganda in the EU countries and the global south countries was very influential. Another component is Russia's nuclear blackmailing of the world. In this case, we also tell that we do not believe this Russian nuclear blackmailing, and you should not believe either. Crimea is the same as any other Ukrainian region, as, for example, the city of Kherson. We have liberated Kherson already last year, and Russia, for whatever reasons, did not apply its nuclear doctrine against Ukraine for this liberation of Kherson as of now. And probably the third important component of this question is that the world is afraid of its misunderstanding of what the world will look like after Ukraine's victory. I think there is little doubt left that Ukraine will win, but no one quite understands what Russia will look like after our victory, in what configuration it will continue to exist. And accordingly, they are very worried about this. And I think that they should start thinking that this is normal, that Russia might not exist, it might have other borders, and we need to get used to this idea and just get ready, that's it.
Do you know if there are any practices of maintaining Ukrainian consciousness, Ukrainian identity in Crimea at the moment, like to maintaining contact with the mainland? Obviously, you have contacts there on the ground. And, for example, when people are talking about how they survived during the Russian occupation of Kherson region, they say that there were certain practices of maintaining contacts with Ukraine. But, of course, Crimea was occupied for a much longer period.
In fact, Crimean residents are very active. We're actively cooperating and communicating with our people starting from 2014. I was working on human rights topics. I was in charge of the Crimean Source organization until 2019. And all of this time, we worked very actively together with Crimean residents. Currently at the representative office, we are also in contact with them. Throughout 2022, despite the Russian full-scale invasion, we had about 2,500 calls through the representative office. In 2021, we had 9,000 such calls. This is a large number of hotline calls and emails.
From Crimea?
Yes, these are calls from Crimea, as well as emails and Facebook text in other messengers. We're in active contact with our people. It is very important for us to maintain those contacts. What Ukraine has been doing for the last 9 years from the start of the Crimean occupation is that we were trying to maintain these contacts. For instance, by providing administrative services to our nationals, by issuing Ukrainian documents, by encouraging people to obtain Ukrainian documents. It's all about maintaining these ties. Of course, those ties are not very stable, they're not very strong at the moment, and we will need to actually implement the deoccupation of people consciousness after the liberation of Crimean Peninsula to build these ties anew. But these ties do exist. Not to the extent that we want them to be, as of course we want to have more connections, but they do exist. Regardless of the fact that people understand that someone might show up at their places for those ties, might try to punish them for something, they still do it. And this resistant movement in Crimea that we are now witnessing is unprecedented, in my opinion, since 2014. After the start of the full-scale invasion, we are seeing hundreds of people who are risking their lives or risking being fined for doing something noticeable. Bogdan Ziza poured yellow and blue paint on the administrative building of the occupation authorities in Kyiv, Pretoria. A young boy aged 14 who has recently poured red paint on a 5-meter banner with Putin's face, and now they're trying to hold his parents accountable. Young men who were walking alongside the embankment in Yalta and when asked if they were afraid of a counteroffensive operation by the Ukrainian armed forces, answered, "We support Ukraine." All of these inscriptions, glory to the Ukrainian armed forces are coming, glory to Ukraine, movements Yellow Ribbon, Crimean Fighting Seagull, Crimean Partisan, Atesh, and so on. Truth being told, we have not seen such activities, such pro-Ukrainian activities within the last 8 years. This activist movement was always aimed at human rights issues. If someone is detained, people will show up to support them, will stream videos on social media. Everything was revolving around human rights topic. Now everything is revolving around Ukraine, around liberation of Ukrainian territories and expectations that Ukraine should liberate this territory.
And this is happening now because people are seeing chances of returning the Crimean Peninsula militarily, right?
Absolutely. When we were asking activists who were moving to Ukraine's mainland after being criminally persecuted or were at risk of criminal persecution, when we asked them, why didn't you do anything for the last 8 years and now you decided to do something? And for example, Bogdan Ziza said, we understand that now is the moment when we can do something good for our country. We can't be indifferent. We need to show that Crimea is waiting for Ukraine. And because they see that the deoccupation can happen in a rather short-term perspective, earlier than what they have imagined a year before the full-scale invasion.
What is the first thing you are planning to do in a liberated Crimea?
First of all, I will definitely go there because I'm currently banned from visiting Crimea. Of course, it will involve working full-time, but I have relatives living there. I will definitely go to my parents' house. I will eat something my mom cooked, I will drink coffee my mom prepared, and then go to work.
I wish you those plans to be materialized as soon as possible.
That was the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast with amazing Tamila Tasheva, the permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and I hope that your dream to go back to Crimea and drink coffee in Crimea in the house of your parents will be very real very soon. Thank you so much for this interview.